I never believed in the supernatural. Growing up in a small town, ghost stories were a way to pass the time, not something to be taken seriously. That changed last summer when my family moved into the old house on Willow Lane. The house had character, as my mom liked to say. To me, it just seemed creepy. The first few weeks were uneventful, just the usual creaks and groans of an old house settling. But everything changed one sweltering afternoon when I decided to explore the attic. The attic was a dusty, forgotten space filled with the remnants of previous owners. Boxes of old books, broken furniture, and other oddities cluttered the room. In the far corner, half hidden by an old rocking chair, I found it, a doll. It was a grotesque thing, with a cracked porcelain face and faded blue eyes that seemed to follow you around the room. Its clothes were tattered, and a shock of matted, blonde hair crowned its head. Despite its unsettling appearance, I felt compelled to take it downstairs. I don't know why, but something about the doll drew me in. I dusted it off and placed it on the living room mantel, thinking it might add a touch of history to the room. My parents were amused by my find, but my little sister, Emily, was fascinated. She stared at the doll with wide eyes, almost as if she recognized it. That night, as the house settled into a deep, quiet slumber, I heard a soft, scraping sound. I shrugged it off as my imagination and drifted back to sleep. But the next morning, I found the doll sitting in the hallway, closer to my room. "Did you move the doll?" I asked Emily during breakfast. She shook her head, her face pale. "No, but I heard it singing last night." I laughed nervously. "Dolls don't sing, Em. You probably just had a bad dream." But the following night, I heard the scraping sound again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. My heart pounded in my chest as I got out of bed and slowly opened my door. There it was, the doll, now perched on the top of the stairs. Fear gripped me. I picked it up and locked it in an old chest in the attic, hoping to forget about it. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. That night, the scraping sound was relentless. It echoed through the house, a chilling reminder that the doll was not where I had left it. With trembling hands, I opened my bedroom door and froze. The doll was sitting at the end of the hallway, its cracked face twisted into a sinister grin, its blue eyes staring directly at me. It was closer now, much closer. I slammed my door shut and leaned against it, my heart racing. Whatever this thing was, it was not just a doll. It was something far more sinister, something that wanted to be found. And I had found it. I spent the rest of that night wide awake, clutching my blanket like it was some sort of shield. Every creak, every gust of wind outside seemed amplified in the darkness, keeping me on edge. As the first light of dawn filtered through my curtains, I finally dared to open my bedroom door. The hallway was empty. The doll was gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. My curiosity got the better of me, and I ventured down to the living room. There it was, sitting calmly on the mantel as if it had never moved. I could almost convince myself that everything had been a nightmare, but Emily's words about the singing haunted me. "Morning," my dad's voice startled me from my thoughts. "You're up early." "Yeah, couldn't sleep," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Dad, do you think there's anything weird about this house?" He looked at me over his coffee mug, raising an eyebrow. "Weird? How so?" "Like, noises at night or things moving around." He laughed. "Old houses make noises. As for things moving around, maybe you're just imagining things. Or maybe Emily's playing tricks on you." I nodded, but his explanation did little to comfort me. As the day wore on, I tried to keep busy, but the doll was never far from my mind. That evening, I decided to confide in my best friend, Matt. "Dude, you're just spooking yourself out," he said when I told him about the doll. "But if it bothers you that much, why don't we get rid of it?" I hesitated. Despite everything, the idea of throwing the doll away filled me with dread. "I don't know, what if it's valuable or something?" "Valuable? It's just an old doll. Look, I'll come over tonight, and we'll chuck it in the garbage. Easy." That night, Matt came over, and we crept up to the attic. The doll was still on the mantel, its eerie eyes reflecting the dim light. "Here goes nothing," Matt said, grabbing the doll. As soon as his fingers touched it, the lights flickered, and a cold draft swept through the room. We both froze, but Matt shook it off. "See? Just an old house." We put the doll in a garbage bag, tied it up, and took it out to the curb. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease, but at least the doll was out of the house. The night was calm, and I managed to sleep soundly for the first time in days. But the peace was shattered when I woke up to Emily's scream. I raced to her room, my heart pounding. "What's wrong?" She pointed to the foot of her bed, trembling. There, sitting upright with its cracked face and faded eyes, was the doll. How is that possible?" Matt stammered from behind me. He had stayed the night, just in case. Emily's sobs were the only sound in the room as I picked up the doll, my hands shaking. "We threw this away," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. Matt and I checked the garbage bin outside. The bag was still there, tied up exactly as we had left it, but it was empty. "This is messed up, man," Matt said. "What do we do now?" I didn't have an answer. The doll was back, and it was clear it didn't intend to leave. The game it was playing was far from over, and I feared we were only just beginning to understand the rules. After the terrifying reappearance of the doll, Matt and I decided to keep it in plain sight in the living room, hoping that would somehow keep its eerie antics at bay. Emily refused to be in the same room with it, her usually bright demeanor now clouded with fear. Days passed, and the doll remained motionless on the mantel, almost lulling us into a false sense of security. But the nights were a different story. I began to have vivid nightmares, each more disturbing than the last. In one, I was trapped in the attic, surrounded by hundreds of dolls, all with the same cracked faces and sinister grins, their eyes following my every move. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the doll's haunting presence looming over my mind. Emily's behavior changed too. She became withdrawn, hardly speaking, and when she did, it was about the doll's whispers. She insisted it talk to her at night, promising terrible things. My parents, concerned but skeptical, decided it was best to remove the doll entirely. They didn't believe in the supernatural, but they hoped taking it out of the house might ease our minds. We packed the doll in a sturdy box and drove out to a secluded wooded area miles from our home. We buried it deep, making sure no one would ever stumble upon it. As we drove back, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, convinced this would finally end our ordeal. That night, the house was eerily quiet. I drifted into a restless sleep, only to be awakened by a soft, melodic hum. I sat up, heart racing, and listened. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a childlike lullaby echoing through the halls. I crept out of bed, the humming growing louder as I approached the living room. The sight that greeted me froze me in place. The doll was back on the mantel, its head slightly tilted, eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "This can't be happening," I muttered, backing away. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence. I turned to run back to my room but collided with Emily standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with terror. "It's angry," she whispered. "It's not going to let us go." In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly oppressive. The once cozy home now felt like a prison. The doll would move around the house at will, always closer to our bedrooms at night. Emily's mental state deteriorated. She claimed the doll wanted her to do things, terrible things. One evening, as a storm raged outside, I decided we had to take more drastic measures. "We need to destroy it," I told Matt, who had been staying with us ever since the first night we tried to dispose of the doll. "Fire. It's the only way." We waited until my parents were asleep, then snuck the doll into the backyard. The wind howled around us as we built a small fire pit. I threw the doll onto the flames, watching as the fire consumed it. The flames roared higher, casting sinister shadows across our faces. For a moment, I felt victorious, believing we had finally rid ourselves of the cursed object. But then the fire inexplicably died down, snuffed out as if by an unseen force. The doll lay in the ashes, untouched, its eyes now glowing a malevolent red. A low, guttural voice filled the air, not Emily's or mine, but something ancient and vengeful. "You cannot destroy what has been bound," it hissed. "Your suffering has only just begun." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a haunted doll, it was something far more sinister. Something that had latched onto our family, feeding off our fear. "We have to find out what it wants," Matt said, his voice trembling. "And how to stop it." With dread gnawing at our insides, we returned to the house. The storm outside seemed to mirror the chaos brewing within. We needed answers, and quickly. The doll's game was escalating, and if we didn't figure out how to end it, I feared we might not survive the night. With the realization that we were dealing with something far more sinister than a haunted doll, Matt and I knew we had to dig deeper into the history of the house and the doll itself. The internet provided little information, so we decided to visit the local library, hoping to find some old records or newspaper articles. The library was a quiet, dusty place that smelled of old books and secrets. The librarian, an elderly woman with keen eyes, seemed intrigued when we mentioned the house on Willow Lane. "Ah, the old Blackwood estate," she said, leading us to the archives. "That place has a dark history, you know." We spent hours sifting through old newspapers and records. What we found was disturbing. The house had changed hands many times over the decades, each family leaving abruptly after a series of unexplained tragedies. But it was an article from the 1920s that caught our attention. The headline read, "Tragedy Strikes Blackwood Family." According to the article, a young girl named Annabelle Blackwood had died under mysterious circumstances. Her parents claimed she had become obsessed with a doll, which they believed was cursed. The article mentioned strange occurrences in the house, culminating in Annabelle's tragic death. What if the doll is Annabelle's? Matt suggested. Maybe her spirit is trapped in it, or something worse. We found an old photograph of Annabelle holding the very doll we had discovered. Her eyes were hauntingly similar to the doll's, sending shivers down my spine. Determined to uncover more, we decided to visit the town's historical society, hoping to find more detailed records. The historical society was housed in an old building that seemed to creak with the weight of history. The curator, a stern man named Mr. Thompson, was initially reluctant to help us, but when we showed him the photograph, his demeanor changed. "This doll is part of a dark chapter in our town's history," he said, pulling out a thick ledger. The Blackwood family was well known, but their end was shrouded in mystery and fear. Mr. Thompson recounted the tale of Annabelle, who had been a lonely child. Her parents, desperate to appease her, had given her the doll. Soon after, they began to notice changes in her behavior. She talked to the doll as if it were alive, claiming it whispered secrets to her. When Annabelle died, the family was so terrified that they sealed the doll in a chest and left the house, never to return. Legend has it, Mr. Thompson continued, that the doll is a vessel for a malevolent spirit. Anyone who disturbs it is cursed. A cold chill ran down my spine. We had disturbed the doll, and now it was haunting us. As we left the historical society, Matt and I knew we had to act quickly. Back at the house, Emily was waiting for us, her face pale and drawn. "It's getting worse," she whispered. "The doll, it's moving more. It's watching us." We gathered in the living room, the doll sitting ominously on the mantel. I shared everything we had learned with my parents. At first, they were skeptical, but as I recounted the history of the Blackwood family and Annabelle's tragic fate, their expressions turned to fear. "We need to put the doll back where it belongs," my dad said, his voice shaking. "Seal it away, just like the Blackwoods did." That night, we carried the doll back to the attic, placing it in the old chest we had found it in. We sealed the chest with heavy chains and a padlock, hoping it would contain the malevolent force. As an extra precaution, we scattered salt around the chest, a traditional ward against evil. Exhausted, we returned to our rooms, hoping this would finally bring an end to our nightmare. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The doll's presence still lingered, a dark shadow that refused to be dispelled. That night, my dreams were filled with visions of Annabelle, her sad eyes pleading for help. I woke up with a start, my room eerily silent. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the attic, followed by a spine-chilling laugh. My heart raced as I realized the truth: we hadn't contained the evil. We had only angered it. The doll's game was far from over, and the stakes had just become deadly. The crash from the attic echoed through the house, making my blood run cold. I scrambled out of bed and rushed to the hallway, where my family was already gathering. My dad held a flashlight, his face pale and determined. "We need to check it out," he said, his voice steady but strained. We climbed the creaky stairs to the attic, each step feeling like a descent into madness. The air grew colder, and a sense of dread settled over us. As we reached the top, my dad shone the flashlight around, revealing the source of the crash. The chest lay in splinters, chains broken, the padlock shattered. The doll was gone. A low, sinister laugh filled the room, coming from all directions and none. Emily clung to my mom, who whispered calming words despite her own fear. I felt a surge of anger and helplessness. How could we fight something we couldn't understand? "We need to get out of this house," Matt said urgently. "Now." We retreated to the living room, the oppressive atmosphere following us. My parents agreed to leave, and we quickly packed a few essentials. But as we reached the front door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. No matter how hard we pulled, it wouldn't budge. "We're trapped," my mom whispered, her voice trembling. I glanced at Emily, who was staring at something behind us, her eyes wide with terror. I turned slowly and saw the doll, sitting on the bottom step of the staircase, its eyes glowing with malevolent glee. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The doll's head tilted, and a voice filled the room, not from the doll itself but from the very walls. "You disturbed my rest. Now you will pay." The room plunged into darkness. I fumbled for the light switch, but it was useless. The only light came from the doll's eerie eyes, casting twisted shadows on the walls. A sudden, sharp pain shot through my head, and I fell to my knees, clutching my temples. Visions flashed before my eyes, Annabelle's life, her loneliness, the day she received the doll, and the terrifying transformation that followed. I saw her final moments, trapped in a nightmare, her soul consumed by the malevolent spirit within the doll. When the visions subsided, I found myself on the floor, gasping for breath. The others were similarly affected, struggling to stand. Emily's sobs cut through the silence. "We need to find another way to banish it," Matt said urgently. "Something stronger, more permanent." Desperate for answers, we turned to the one place we hadn't fully explored, the old family diary we found in the attic. My mom retrieved it, and we gathered around, poring over the yellowed pages. The diary belonged to Annabelle's mother. It detailed their initial joy upon moving into the house, followed by the slow descent into horror as the doll's influence grew. The entries became increasingly frantic, describing strange occurrences, Annabelle's erratic behavior, and finally, the decision to seal the doll away. "The spirit attached to the doll demands a vessel," one entry read. "It feeds on fear and suffering. We tried to appease it, but it only grew stronger. If only we had known." The last entry was smeared and barely legible, but one word stood out: fire. "We tried burning it," I said, frustrated. "It didn't work." My dad shook his head. "Not just fire. There's something we're missing." We read further, finally finding a clue. The spirit could be banished by burning the doll, but only with a specific ritual involving an ancient incantation. The incantation was scrawled at the bottom of the page, barely legible. "We need to do this right," my mom said, her voice resolute. "It's our only chance." We gathered the necessary items: salt, candles, and a lighter. As we prepared, the house seemed to come alive with whispers and shadows, the doll's presence growing stronger. With trembling hands, we formed a circle around the doll, now placed in a metal basin. My dad lit the candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows. My mom began to chant the incantation, her voice steady. Despite the fear in her eyes, the doll's eyes flared brighter, and a chilling wind swept through the room. I joined in the chant, feeling a strange power in the ancient words. The doll seemed to writhe, as if in pain, its porcelain skin cracking further. The flames from the candles grew, merging into a single, intense blaze. My mom poured salt around the basin, completing the ritual circle. As the final words of the incantation echoed through the room, I struck the lighter and set the doll ablaze. A blood-curdling scream erupted from the doll, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. The fire roared higher, consuming the doll, the malevolent spirit thrashing in agony. The temperature in the room soared, and we stepped back, shielding our eyes from the intense light. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the fire died down. The doll was reduced to ash, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. A calm, eerie silence settled over the house. "It's over," my dad said, his voice barely above a whisper. We stood there, exhausted but relieved, hoping that we had finally broken the curse. The house felt different, lighter, as if a dark presence had been lifted. But deep down, a lingering doubt remained. Had we truly rid ourselves of the malevolent spirit, or had we merely bought ourselves some time? Only time would tell, but for now, we were free. The days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Emily was recovering, and the oppressive air that had once suffocated our home seemed to have lifted. But even in the calm, an underlying tension lingered. We knew the malevolent spirit was out there, waiting for another chance to strike. One evening, Matt and I decided to revisit the attic, hoping to find more clues. Armed with flashlights, we climbed the narrow stairs, the beams creaking under our weight. The attic was just as we had left it, dusty, cluttered, and filled with relics of the past. We searched through old trunks and boxes, finding nothing of particular interest until Matt stumbled upon an old wooden chest hidden behind a pile of broken furniture. It was locked, but the lock was rusted and weak. With a bit of effort, we managed to break it open. Inside, we found a collection of letters and photographs, all addressed to the Blackwood family. Among the letters, one stood out, a thick envelope sealed with a faded wax stamp. I opened it carefully, revealing a stack of handwritten pages. The first page was dated from the late 1800s and signed by a woman named Eliza Blackwood. To whoever finds this letter, it began, "Know that the spirit bound to this house is ancient and powerful. It has plagued my family for generations, feeding on our fears and tragedies. It was a mistake to anchor it to the doll, but it was our last desperate attempt to contain it." As I read on, I learned that the spirit had been summoned during a seance gone wrong, and ever since, it had attached itself to the Blackwood bloodline, transferring from one generation to the next. The only way to banish it permanently, Eliza continued, is to sever its connection to our bloodline by returning it to where it was summoned and performing the ritual of binding. The ritual requires an artifact from the summoning, the blood of the living descendant, and the ashes of the vessel it last inhabited. My heart raced as I realized what this meant. We had the doll's ashes, but we needed to find the place where the spirit was originally summoned. I shared the letter with Matt, and we both agreed that we needed to find this location if we had any hope of ending the curse for good. The following morning, we gathered my family and explained our plan. Despite their fear, they agreed to help. Using old maps and the letters we found, we traced the location of the original Blackwood estate, a secluded manor on the outskirts of town, long abandoned and rumored to be haunted. We set out at dusk, determined to finish what the Blackwoods had started. The manor was a crumbling ruin, its once grand architecture now overtaken by nature. We navigated through the overgrown path, feeling the weight of history pressing down on us. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The walls were lined with old portraits, their eyes seeming to follow us as we moved deeper into the house. Finally, we found the parlor where the seance had taken place, an ornate room with a large, round table at its center. We arranged the items as instructed, placing the doll's ashes in a silver bowl, lighting black candles, and preparing the ancient artifact, a small, intricately carved wooden box. I hesitated as I pricked my finger, letting a drop of blood fall into the bowl. My mom began to chant the incantation from Eliza's letter, her voice strong and steady. As the words filled the room, the temperature dropped, and a powerful wind swept through the house, extinguishing the candles. The only light came from the glowing ashes in the bowl, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Suddenly, the spirit materialized, a dark, swirling mass of smoke and shadow. Its eyes burned with a malevolent fire as it hovered above us, its presence oppressive and terrifying. "You cannot banish me," it hissed, its voice echoing through the room. "I am eternal." With a final, determined effort, we continued the incantation, our voices merging into one. The spirit shrieked in rage, its form writhing as it fought against the binding spell. The air crackled with energy, and the ground beneath us trembled. Just as it seemed the spirit would overpower us, a blinding light erupted from the bowl, engulfing the room. The spirit's scream reached a deafening pitch before it was abruptly silenced. The light faded, leaving us in stunned silence. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by an almost palpable sense of peace. The spirit was gone, banished back to the void from which it had come. We had done it, we had ended the curse. Exhausted but relieved, we left the manor, its dark history finally put to rest. As we walked back to our car, I glanced back one last time, feeling a sense of closure. The nightmare was truly over, and the Blackwood family, as well as ours, could finally be free. But as we drove away, I couldn't help but wonder, had we truly seen the last of the malevolent spirit, or was this just the beginning of a new chapter in its dark saga? For a while, it seemed like our lives had returned to normal. The house on Willow Lane felt safe, and the memories of our ordeal began to fade. Emily smiled more, and even the nightmares that had haunted me became less frequent. We believed we had finally freed ourselves from the malevolent spirit that had plagued us. But as the weeks turned into months, a sense of unease slowly crept back into our lives. It started with small things, objects moving on their own, cold drafts in the middle of summer, and whispers in the night. We tried to dismiss them as residual fear, but deep down, we knew something was wrong. The final straw came one night when Emily woke up screaming, clutching her wrist where a burn mark in the shape of a doll's hand had appeared. "We didn't finish it," Emily sobbed. "It's still here. It's coming for us." Desperation and fear gripped us once more. We needed to find a permanent solution, and fast. With renewed determination, we returned to the old diary of Eliza Blackwood, searching for anything we might have missed. It was then that we discovered a hidden page, stuck to the back cover. The page detailed a failsafe ritual, A final reckoning that could banish the spirit forever, but it required a great sacrifice. The ritual needed to be performed at the exact location where the spirit was summoned and required the life force of someone who had a direct connection to the spirit. My heart sank as I realized what this meant. The spirit had latched onto Emily, and now it demanded her life. "There has to be another way," my mom pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "There isn't," I said, my voice breaking. "But maybe we can trick it. We'll use my life force instead." The plan was risky and uncertain, but we had no other choice. We gathered our supplies and set out for the old Blackwood Manor one last time. The night was dark and stormy, fitting for the final battle we were about to face. Inside the crumbling manor, we prepared the ritual space. Emily stood at the center, her face pale but determined. I took her place at the last moment, hoping the spirit would not realize the switch until it was too late. We began the incantation, our voices merging with the howling wind. The spirit materialized, more powerful and enraged than ever. It lunged at Emily, but as it passed through the circle of protection, it hesitated, sensing the switch. I stepped forward, drawing its attention. "Take me instead," I shouted. "Leave her alone." The spirit recoiled, its fiery eyes narrowing. It let out a guttural laugh, understanding my intention. "You think you can deceive me?" it hissed. "Your sacrifice is in vain." The ground trembled as the spirit attacked, its force overwhelming. Pain shot through me as it tried to consume my life force. I felt my strength draining, the world around me dimming. But I held on, focusing on the love I had for my family. "Now!" I screamed, and my dad completed the final part of the ritual, binding the spirit's essence to a new vessel, a small, sealed jar we had prepared. The spirit shrieked, its form twisting and contorting as it was drawn into the jar. The ground shook violently, and then, suddenly, everything was still. The jar glowed brightly before fading to a dull, ominous pulse. It was over. The spirit was contained, its power broken. I collapsed to the floor, barely conscious but alive. My family rushed to my side, their relief palpable. We buried the jar deep in the woods, far from any place it could harm again. As we covered it with earth, I felt a sense of finality, a peace that had eluded us for so long. Life slowly returned to normal, but the experience left its mark on us all. We were closer, stronger, and more appreciative of the peace we had fought so hard to regain. The house on Willow Lane became a true home once more, its dark past finally laid to rest. Years later, as I told the story to my own children, I made sure they understood the importance of respect and caution when dealing with the unknown. The spirit was gone, but the lessons we learned remained. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind howls just right, I could almost hear a faint, distant whisper, a reminder of the darkness we had faced and the light we had fought to protect. The end.